All right, everyone. It's another Wednesday night. That means we're talking some ACC football at 8 o'clock Eastern time. And on this fine Wednesday evening in June, with not a whole lot going on, we're going to make up a little rundown of the best non-conference games in the ACC. And we bring in Dan Rubin from BC Interruption. We may be joined by some other of the top bloggers in the conference. So I am quite impressed, Dan, as I mentioned a few minutes ago before we came on, by the slate of ACC out-of-conference games. I am one who believes that there are not enough really good quality non-conference games amongst the Power Five. If you look across the board, most teams schedule one game, that one really difficult game. Some teams go to two. There are a smattering of teams, North Carolina State, who don't schedule anyone, and that has to change because the leagues are really pressing these teams to schedule somebody. And I think, two of the reasons why the ACC has such a difficult non-conference schedule is, number one, because they've got those traditional matchups with the SEC at the end of the season. Louisville, Kentucky, Florida State, Georgia Tech, Clemson, South Carolina, usually really good matchups. And on top of that, now that Notre Dame has been brought into a quasi situation with the ACC, you've got 5 more games with Notre Dame. Notre Dame's usually one of the 10 or 15 best teams in the country. So it makes for a lot of really good matchups. So Dan, want to hear what really catches your eye when you scan the schedule September until December?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head when we're talking about the non-conference scheduling of how it gets to a point where it's pretty bad in some regards. I know NC State the last few years has made a bowl game on the basis of we're going to play 4 cupcakes, and that's something we're potentially experiencing at Boston College this year. Last year, the Eagles had the 2 FCS games, but they did have the scheduled game against Notre Dame. And what we're realizing this year is that Boston College plays 4 games non-conference, and none of them are against, what we would refer to as decent teams. You get a game against UMass, you get a game against Buffalo, you get a game against Connecticut, and we could talk about that a little later. But then you get a game against a team like Wagner. So you get 3 games plus an FCS gimme. It's you're trying to make it to 6-6 very obviously just by winning 4 really lousy non-conference games. The team that actually I'm a little more impressed with this year than I have been in past years is North Carolina State, who you mentioned. They're playing at East Carolina this year. I think that's a sneaky game for them because, number one, NC State is not NC State the way that they have been the last couple of years. They're going to be a very different-looking team this year, and they're going to an East Carolina team on the road that'll play Purple Haze, bring out Steve the Pirate, and upset a couple teams here and there. So I don't necessarily know that that they're going to be as easily scheduled as in the past. But you're right. You hit some of those SEC, ACC matchups, and you try to fill in some of the other ways around it, and you wind up with a relatively weak non-conference schedule. What you hope is that it the Notre Dame scheduling agreement works out to some teams' favor so they don't play 4 cupcakes, and then you're relying on conference scheduling to get you the rest of the way. So it'll be really interesting. I've got my list. I know you've got yours, and it's a we'll see who comes out on top because there are some big games on tap.
So, Dan, before we turn you loose, I'll just set up everyone so they've got a reference point to go by here. So we mentioned the SEC and the ACC getting together that last week of the season. Again, that's Florida State, Clemson, South Carolina, Georgia Tech, Louisville, Kentucky. It's been a really good matchup in recent years, very recent years, for the ACC, where South Carolina for many years, I think 6 consecutive against good Clemson teams, dominated that series. Clemson has turned the tide in the last 2 years, of course, going on to the national championship game and laying waste to the Gamecocks, who have just wilted in the last couple seasons. Florida State's had the much better of Florida in recent years. Georgia, always a huge series lead against Georgia Tech, but Georgia Tech little bit more competitive recently and winning that game a couple years ago. Kentucky, Louisville, the Cardinals, a much better team than Kentucky, usually win that game in a fairly competitive fashion, but that's been the situation. So here's the rest of the rundown. You got on opening day, Clemson at Auburn. Auburn's been down, but still difficult SEC team on the road for the defending ACC champions. North Carolina, Georgia, I think that's a tremendous matchup there. On the 5th, so that's Labor Day night for the nation to see, Florida State, Ole Miss. Wow. On the 10th, the next weekend, Pitt, Penn State, traditional rivals, get back together. Virginia Tech, Tennessee, they're playing at Bristol Speedway. That brings a whole new element to it. Virginia goes out to Oregon to probably get smashed, but who knows? The Cavaliers like to do that to themselves. North Carolina taking on Illinois. The Tar Heels just completely obliterated the Illini last year. Okay, the next weekend, the 17th, you've got a Syracuse, South Florida game. You got Pitt going out to Oklahoma State. So rarely do the ACC and the Big 12 get together. So that's a nice little matchup. Virginia, UConn. You got Georgia Tech, Vandy, Duke, Northwestern. That's been a nice little elite school academic matchup between those two, with Northwestern winning last year. Okay, last weekend of September, Syracuse, UConn, Wake Forest, Indiana. They played a high-scoring game last year. Duke, Notre Dame. That's one of the 5 matchups against the Irish. Then you've basically got the other games against Notre Dame on the 1st. Syracuse, Notre Dame. On the 8th of October, North Carolina State, Notre Dame. On the 29th, Miami at Notre Dame. And if you've been around college football for 25, 30 years, you're going to love to see that one. Okay, November 17th, a very intriguing matchup, I think, here. Louisville going to Houston. And then on that Saturday, the 19th, you got Virginia Tech, Notre Dame, and you got BC taking on UConn. So, Jim, we'll welcome you to the party as well. We're talking some ACC non-conference games. We've kind of set up the schedule. And Dan and I kind of agree that the ACC has upped the ante in recent years by signing Notre Dame to the 5 games, and then they already had those rivalry games at the end of November with the SEC. So strong non-conference scheduling out of the ACC. So Dan, we'll hit you up first with the games you're looking at, and then Jim will talk to you.
Well, I think one of the games that I would love to get to is that game at Bristol, the Tennessee Virginia Tech game. Bristol Motor Speedway, Thunder Valley. That place has if that gets packed with 120-something thousand people, it is amazing for a NASCAR race. And I can only imagine putting a football field in the middle of it and potentially having the noise that the crowd has for that under the lights. That's going to be that has a boomer bust type feel, because if you sell that out and you make it really special, that's going to be absolutely insane. Plus, it's the opening weekend, essentially. It's one of the first, I think it is the first game for Virginia Tech under Coach Fuente. So that's going to be welcome to Virginia Tech. You're playing at Bristol Motor Speedway. I think that's just going to be absolutely phenomenal. Some of the other games, I think you nailed it with Florida State, Ole Miss. That's probably the game I'm looking forward to the most, just because I think Ole Miss is fantastic. Florida State, again, going to be interesting to see how they move on from last year's team. Some of the players that they've lost moving on from Jalen Ramsey, and they're moving on, opening up against an Ole Miss team that's coming ready to party. That's going to be in Orlando. So on the bright side for Florida State, they don't have to go down to the Grove, but on the downside, they do have to go down to Orlando, and Ole Miss fans are fanatical about that school. Clemson, Auburn, it's on the road. It's a tough match for Clemson. Auburn, they're going to have something to prove. I don't necessarily think that Auburn's on the level of Clemson if you look strictly off last year, no matter what Clemson loses or brings back, but it's still going to be a great atmosphere. And Miami, Notre Dame, what more can you say about something like that? Catholics versus convicts, as they used to say back in the day. I loved it back then. I hope Miami, for Miami's sake, returns to some of its roots and embraces what will be the classic feel to that, goes into that game as the anti-Notre Dame at Notre Dame, and decides to revisit some of their roots and get back to what used to work for them, getting a little bit of under Mark. I know Mark Richt, he's a great coach. I know that he is a great coach. I can't say I know him personally, but I would love to see just Miami embrace being Miami. It seems like they've been running away from that, and just go back to what they were in that game and try to punch Notre Dame in the mouth, because that would just be absolutely fantastic to watch.
Dan, if you ever become buddies with Mark Richt, he needs an invite to the show. So that would be a must.
I'd be more than happy to get him one. I just gotta find out. I gotta talk to Cam about that. That's all that means.
I did a quick tally here, and I think we're pretty comfortable in saying that the SEC is the best conference in college football until proven otherwise. I don't think the gap's what it's been in the past. But the ACC plays 9 games against the SEC, 5 against Notre Dame, 3 against the Big Ten, amongst all these matchups. So, Jim, when you look over this schedule for the ACC, Jim Hammett from Cardiac Hill covering Pitt football with us here, as usual. Jim, what catches your eye?
A game that catches my eye that he did not mention was that North Carolina-Georgia game in Atlanta. I think that's another one of those neutral site first game of the year type deals. And you're going to look at North Carolina breaking in a new quarterback trying to replace Marquise Williams. So I think that's a real big game for North Carolina. And since we always talk about the Coastal's kind of jumbled, you're going to see what Carolina's made of and see if they're ready to defend their title. So that's one that sticks out to me, obviously. Another one, obviously, a lot of the ones he mentioned, Clemson, Auburn. That's just one of those big games. Auburn's not quite as good as they have been in the past, but they might be due for a bounce back. And another game that's obviously caught my attention is Pitt-Penn State, the return of the game. They haven't played since 2000, so it's going to be a pretty hyped-up atmosphere. It's the same weekend as the Bristol game, but September 10th in Pittsburgh, it's going to be pretty wild.
All right, guys, I had to go the list route. That's just me. I can't help myself. So I had to try to rank these things 1 through 10. So we'll start at number 10. You got a couple of historically awful football programs who are now good. They played last season at Duke. Northwestern pulled out the win. So you got the Wildcats coming off a 10-3 season. Duke won its first bowl game, the Pinstripe Bowl, in forever, like 1962. Couple football programs that really, really try hard, obviously have the brains, and they put together good football programs despite the academic limitations, and that's my number 10 game. Duke at Northwestern, pretty good matchup there. Number 9, North Carolina State, as we talked about off the top, Dan, finally going to play somebody out of conference that's worth anything because the ACC's forcing them to, taking on Notre Dame there in Raleigh-Durham. So you've got North Carolina State on October 8th taking on Notre Dame. That's my number 9 game. All right, at number 8, Pitt going to Oklahoma State. The Panthers coming off a nice 8-4 regular season going to Oklahoma State. The Big 12 and the ACC rarely get together, so I think the Panthers testing themselves last year going to Iowa. This year it's against Oklahoma State and playing, as Jim mentioned, Penn State and Oklahoma State back-to-back. So testing themselves right there. That's my number 8 game. All right, number 7, I've got Clemson-Auburn. Yes, the Tigers lost 6 games last year. They've been pretty marginal the last 2 years. It's still an SEC fast team and talented team. It's still a top 15 recruited team if you look at the class rankings taking on Clemson. So that's going to be a tough spot for the defending national champions potentially on opening night where the Auburn fans are going to be very rabid. At number 6, the Bristol Speedway atmosphere and environment kind of adds something to it, as you talked about, Dan. Virginia Tech, Tennessee, the Volunteers probably going to be the favorite in the SEC Eastern Division. That's my game number 6. At number 5, I go back to the late 70s, early 80s. It just makes sense, and it feels right. The Pitt and Penn State get together, and they'll do so at Heinz Field, and that's a really good football matchup. They're very comparable teams in terms of being top 25 to 35 teams in the nation. It should be a really good matchup, although Jim and I talked about it a few weeks ago. Pitt coming into this one, at least at this point, a couple months to opening day, a pretty substantial favorite, somewhat surprisingly. So that's my number 5 game. All right, at number 4, intriguing late season matchup. We know what Houston did last year in the American Athletic Conference, and if you size up their schedule, they have a date with Oklahoma in week 1. If Houston wins that game, quarterback is back, most of their offensive weapons are back. If they can run the table in the American Athletic, they're going to be hosting Louisville on November 17th, the second to last week of the season, possibly with a playoff berth on the line. I know I'm stretching it a bit. There's a long way to go, but I think that's an intriguing matchup, and the Cardinals showed us a lot of potential to be a better program late in the season after getting off to an 0-3 start. I think the Cardinals are going to be tough, and they take on Houston late in the season. All right, at number 3, North Carolina, Georgia. Yeah, the Tar Heels go to the ACC championship game last year. I think even despite the loss of Marquise Williams, Mitch Trubisky should be a capable fill-in there, and they are back and loaded at wide receiver with Mac Hollins and Ryan Switzer and company, Bug Howard, and have Elijah Hood back at running back, taking on a Georgia football team with Kirby Smart in place on the sideline for the first time in 15 years. No Mark Richt in Athens. That one being that ACC SEC game at the Georgia Dome on opening night. All right, at number 2, I'm going Miami Notre Dame for all the things that Dan outlined. Plus, they're two pretty good football teams and should be roughly in the top 15 in the country that the last week of October. My number 1 game is on Labor Day night, opening weekend, Ole Miss taking on Florida State. I think that is going to be one premier matchup with the Seminoles trying to get back to the top of the ACC. Obviously, this doesn't count toward a conference championship, but it's going to be huge in them wanting to get back into the college football playoff talk, and the Rebels have been on the brink of winning an SEC championship the last couple of years, and they got their quarterback Chad Kelly back after throwing for 4,000 yards. So those are my top 10. Again, I pushed the late season SEC matchups against Florida and South Carolina and the like, and just focused on the early season matchups for non-conference play. All right. Well, Pitt, I'm very interested, Jim, in your thoughts about Pitt's scheduling of Penn State at home. Then you got to go out to Oklahoma State. So probably rarely does Pitt, or really anyone across the country, schedule that caliber of teams back to back.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a tough stretch there, and they're both like national TV, high level games. So it's going to be tough, and it's going to challenge this Pitt team, obviously. That Iowa game last year, I don't think Pitt realized and anyone realized Iowa was that good. So going into that game, it felt like two evenly matched opponents, and it turns out Iowa ended up going to the Rose Bowl, had a great season. So, but this, you kind of understand Oklahoma State's going to be pretty good. And while I don't think Penn State's going to be great this year, it's still the rivalry game. It's still the return of the Pitt-Penn State game. So it's just going to be a battle. And, second week of the year, this state has been looking forward to it ever since they announced the game.
Hey, Dan, are you good with this Notre Dame series, playing 5 games and rotating the opponents throughout the ACC? Are you pretty comfortable with the way this has started out?
I don't hate it, but there is one aspect that I genuinely despise about it, and that is the fact that and it comes from a more personal standpoint, which is that the Boston College Notre Dame series, I don't think people realize, was for a time as big as it was. They're the only two true Catholic schools at the FBS level, the Power Conference level. They played each other very well through the 2000s. You had a period where Notre Dame dominated them, and then Boston College came back and dominated them back. There was the green jersey jinx game a couple years in the early 2000s. Notre Dame caught back up to BC. BC obviously fell off into their rough season, but they've worked on scheduling each other around that 5-game arrangement. Last year they did that, played each other at Fenway Park. It was not part of the 5-game arrangement. It was the Shamrock Series game. It was nice to see them do that. The one thing I don't like about the arrangement is that Notre Dame lost a little bit of what made some of the Notre Dame rivalries really great. They got to shut down their rivalry against a team like Michigan, and they had to because they had to choose which games they were going to continue to play, and they wound up losing their game against Boston College. For BC, a team that doesn't play power conference teams that often, if at all, they lose a non-conference game against a real rival, and you lose something about that. They're trying to pick it back up with Massachusetts and Connecticut, getting something in regionally, but it's just not the same without Notre Dame. And so for me personally, I don't necessarily like it. It has created some good games and some great matchups. I think Clemson-Notre Dame is something that we wouldn't have had without the scheduling arrangement. I'm glad that Miami is forced to play Notre Dame again, and Notre Dame is forced to play Miami, because I love those rivalry games, and I love seeing like I said, the Catholics and convicts. But it's something for me that is still lacking a little bit.
I'm going to hit you guys up with 2 more questions. One being, if you could only watch one of these games this season, which one would it be? And number 2, take your particular teams, Boston College and Pitt. Who would you like to see them schedule? Dan.
Well, the game I'm looking forward to the most is Boston College, Connecticut. No, just kidding. Actually, I am really looking forward to that. I was joking with you, Mark, before we came up about how I don't think anybody realizes the hatred between those two schools. And if you don't realize it. This is my shameless plug. You have to tune in for that game late in the season because those are two fan bases that could not despise each other anymore.
And we don't realize that, Dan. Is there any particular reason why besides proximity?
Well, Connecticut maybe was kind of looking to leave the Big East a number of years back and maybe had the governor of Connecticut, Daniel Malloy at the time, stumping for them to get into the ACC. And Boston College's athletic director at the time, this is urban legend, I've never heard that this is true or not, but Boston College's athletic director, Gene DiFilippo, led a political movement inside the ACC to block Connecticut from getting in. So Connecticut wound up trying to shop their services everywhere possible, tried bringing in teams into the Big East with Texas Christian and Mountain West teams and Boise State. So Connecticut has always held it against Boston College that they're not in a power league, and they've increasingly held it against Boston College that they feel they belong in a power league. So if you're not used to that type of, if you don't think it exists, oh, that's going to be a fun game. That's just going to be a fun game. But that's my shameless plug. That said, the game I'm looking forward to the most, I know I rehash it, is the Miami-Notre Dame game. They're two good teams. Brad Kaya is a good quarterback, a great quarterback even. I can't wait to see what Mark Richt does for him. And to be honest with you, I'm just really excited for what feels like a traditional matchup between two teams from different cultures. I am so pumped up for that game that it's probably just going to let me down.
So if Boston College could schedule anybody across America, what is the one game you would like to see Boston College schedule?
Well, and this is coming for you, Mark, they actually do have Ohio State on a future schedule. So they are going to play the Buckeyes. For me personally, I would probably head a little bit further south. I would love to see them, but this is all from a personal standpoint, to play a team like in Oklahoma, because I know people who are from Oklahoma who went to OU. But I would love to see them get at least one, Penn State type team on the schedule every year that is not an Alabama. I don't think they would ever need to compete with an SEC team. I don't want to see what would happen with that. But I'd like to see them play more West Coast teams. I'd love to see them play USC again. Maybe make that an annual thing, or go down to the Big 12 and pick up one of those Big 12 teams, because I think playing Texas or playing Oklahoma would be great.
So, Jim, we've got like 20 really good ACC matchups against the nation. What game do you want to see more than any of the others?
I'm going to go with that Louisville-Houston game, because I just think there's going to be a lot on the line, and I think that's going to be Houston's one final chance to say, hey, we need to get in the playoffs if we beat a good Louisville team, maybe not a great Louisville team. So I think there's just going to be a lot at stake, and Houston's coach Herman, he's going to be a hot name coach in the offseason. So they're going to be a fun team to watch. They were a lot of fun to see them play Florida State in the Peach Bowl this past season. So I think that's just going to be a really good atmosphere, playing at Houston as well.
And for the Pitt Panthers, who would you like to see them schedule?
See, that's a tough question, because right now Pitt's going to start their 4-game series with Penn State. Then after that, there isn't anything scheduled. So I'd love to see that go long term. But right after the Penn State series, the West Virginia series starts up, so the Backyard Brawl's renewed. So right now, Pitt fans are kind of at a crossroads where, do they want to play both in the same year, or play maybe Penn State one year, West Virginia the next, or two, something like that. So those are 2 games. Those are all rivalry games. And Dan mentioned about Notre Dame. Pitt's third most common opponent ever is Notre Dame. That's a long-standing rivalry too. So whenever that got switched up, Pitt and Notre Dame played almost every year. So that's another game that maybe people didn't realize, but it was a rivalry here in Western Pennsylvania. It's a very Catholic population. A lot of people like Notre Dame. So the Pitt-Notre Dame game was a traditional game as well.
Yeah, I would like to see, actually, if you look at the Big Ten and the ACC, you see a lot of the underlings in both conferences getting together. We got North Carolina, not that they are or have been the last couple of years, but typically not a great team, great program, taking on Illinois. Then the other ones, Northwestern, Duke, sure, again, they're better now. But we've seen Wake Forest and Indiana get together a few times, and they have in the past. So we see a lot of that level, but rarely do we see, and I cannot think, going back to the early 80s, the last time the Florida States and the Clemsons have gone to play Michigan, Ohio State. I would like to see those matchups. The better teams in the Big Ten and the ACC get together would be an interesting series to see play out. Of course, the ACC and the SEC have the same footprint. Those games get scheduled, and there's regional appeal there and national appeal to those games. But, Florida State, Ohio State would be pretty serious. Clemson, Michigan, something like that would be nice to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Pitt's kind of in that footprint where they're more actually in kind of, stuck right in between Ohio State and Penn State. So, a lot of those rivalries appeal, like the Clemson, South Carolina, Louisville, Kentucky, Florida State. Well, Pitt's more in line with Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan State, even Maryland. Pitt, Maryland would be a cool game to see every once in a while. But I'd love to see Pitt play Michigan State. I think, with Narduzzi coming from Michigan State, I think that would be a fun game to see, kind of the head coach going up against his assistant. I think that'd be a cool one to get on the schedule. But Pitt kind of does fit in that Big Ten footprint a little bit more than the ACC.
Yeah, there was a time when Pitt and Ohio State got together quite a bit, that being in the mid to late 80s, early 90s, several times for about 10 or 12 years there.
Which is funny because I know that when we talk about Pitt and we're talking about them regionally and the geographic footprint, and you talk about the geographic footprint, it's really hard to develop those rivalries when you're not in a particular footprint along with them. And for that, I point out, Syracuse has Pittsburgh in the conference, but a school like Syracuse doesn't have a traditional geographic rival except for maybe Boston College. They don't have anyone non-conference. We certainly don't have anyone non-conference. We're playing them, and it's Massachusetts and Connecticut, but Massachusetts just got kicked out of the Mid-American Conference for football, for lack of a better term. They're an independent this year, and Connecticut is, they're a mid-major school, and I can never admit that they ever went to a Fiesta Bowl because they want a watered-down Big East. So it's not like when you're looking for rivalries, I think it'd be really fun to look for something that changes culturally, to look for different cultures. I know up here in Boston we've got the clogged and the congestion and you wear your fancy clothes and drive your fancy cars. Go down and play in a place like a Mississippi where everything's rural. We actually were just there for baseball, but you go down and play a team that's in a different area where it's a little bit of a culture shock for both sides, and you get to see a little bit of how the other sides live.
How about that Pitt-West Virginia rivalry getting renewed, Jim?
Yeah, that's the thing with this Oklahoma State series coming up is the West Virginia fans say, well, if you're going to play a Big 12 team, why would you not play us? Like, why would you go down and play Oklahoma State? You don't recruit there, But it's just one of those, two like-minded schools just wanted to get together to play a game. But I think with West Virginia and Pitt, it's a great rivalry. Pitt fans kind of hold it over on West Virginia and say, oh, well, we hate Penn State more. You guys are okay. But in the West Virginia fans, that just drives them crazy. They hate Pitt. It's funny, but it's going to be a good game. It's always been spirited. And, you remember a few years ago when Pitt ruined their chance to win a national championship. There was nothing better than that. The 13-9 game, that still gets brought up almost every time you have a Pitt-West Virginia argument.
So, yes, this is what the charge is to the College Football Playoff Committee throughout the second half of the season, is to determine the best teams in the country and trying to compare teams that rarely play, if ever, and don't even usually play teams that played the other team that they're trying to compare. And this is what it comes down to, is trying to determine by extension how good the conferences are, and the best way to do that is look at the best teams in the best conferences, or in the conferences, the Power Five playing each other. So these games are obviously huge. All right, boys, this is ACC Breakdown. It's a Wednesday night, and we bring in the best bloggers in the ACC. That includes, of course, Dan Rubin from BC Interruption and Jim Hammett from Cardiac Hill. All right, guys, I think we did enough damage. Appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Mark.